My hands were shaking as I stared at the small white bottle on the bathroom counter, the overhead light buzzing too loudly, the house too quiet behind me. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender soap, and I remember thinking how wrong it felt that something so ordinary could suddenly feel dangerous. My chest tightened the way it does right before bad news lands, when instinct starts screaming but your mind begs you to stay calm. If you're watching this and you've ever ignored that quiet voice inside you, subscribe and tell me where you're listening from, because stories like this don't start with sirens. They start with silence. I stood there longer than I should have, fingers numb, heart racing, realizing that the life I thought I was protecting might already be slipping through my hands. I didn't know who I could trust anymore, or how deep the truth went. I only knew that something had shifted, and there was no going back. That was the moment everything began to unravel. The moment that stopped, my heart didn't arrive with shouting or chaos. It came softly, almost politely, wrapped in a question my daughter carried like a secret she was afraid to drop. I remember the way the air changed around us, how the room suddenly felt too quiet, as if the walls themselves were listening. My body reacted before my mind could, my chest tightened, my hands went cold, and I knew, before I understood anything, that something was wrong. I am a mother. At that point, I still believed my home was safe, that my marriage was solid, that the people I loved most would never put each other in danger. I believed routines were harmless. I believed trust was enough. And in a single moment, all of that certainty cracked. I looked at my child and saw exhaustion where there should have been light. I saw hesitation where there used to be ease. Her small voice carried more weight than it ever should have, and I felt a deep, instinctive fear rise up in me, sharp and undeniable. It was the kind of fear that doesn't scream, it settles. Nothing about that moment made sense yet. I didn't have answers. I didn't even have questions formed clearly in my mind. All I had was the feeling that something ordinary had turned dangerous, and that ignoring it would cost more than I was willing to lose. That was the beginning. After that, I started noticing things I could no longer explain away. After that moment, my daughter didn't disappear all at once. She faded, slowly enough that I almost convinced myself it was normal. Over the next couple of weeks, the light in her seemed to dim in small, unsettling ways. She slept longer. She moved more carefully, like her body was heavier than it used to be. The child who once filled the house with noise now drifted from room to room in silence, eyes unfocused, energy gone. I noticed it in ordinary moments. Breakfast she barely touched. Homework she stared at as if the numbers no longer made sense. Afternoons when she came home from school and went straight to the couch, curling in on herself instead of telling me about her day. Even her laughter sounded different, thinner, like it took effort. Each change on its own felt explainable. Growth spurts, stress, being tired. That's what I told myself because it was easier than admitting I was scared. Still, something in me kept whispering that this wasn't right. A mother learns the rhythm of her child's body, their moods, their small habits, and the rhythm was off. I felt guilt settle in alongside the fear. I replayed the days in my head, wondering how long this had been happening, wondering why I hadn't pushed harder sooner. I hated myself for hesitating, for choosing comfort over confrontation. At night, after she fell into an unusually deep sleep, I would sit in the quiet house and listen to the hum of appliances, trying to convince myself that nothing was wrong, but the quiet felt heavy, unnatural, like a warning I kept walking past. I realized then that these changes weren't something I could explain away anymore. They were asking to be seen, and as I paid closer attention to my child, I began to pay closer attention to the reassurances I had been accepting from the person who was supposed to protect her too. For years, I believed I knew the man I built my life with. I saw him as steady, dependable, the kind of father who showed up in quiet ways. He packed lunches when I was running late. He kissed our daughter on the forehead before bed. He spoke calmly, confidently, like someone who had nothing to hide. That image was so familiar, so comfortable, that it became a shield against doubt. When I started to worry about our daughter, his explanation slid easily into place. He sounded reasonable, grounded. He reminded me that kids go through phases, that growing bodies need rest, that I worried too much sometimes. And because I loved him, because I trusted him, I let his certainty soften my fear. I questioned myself instead. I told myself I was overreacting, letting anxiety invent problems that didn't exist. But slowly, something shifted. His reassurances began to feel too smooth, too ready. They didn't change even as my daughter did. The same calm tone, the same dismissive logic, repeated again and again. I noticed how quickly he brushed past my concerns, how easily he redirected the conversation. I started to feel foolish for doubting him, and at the same time uneasy for accepting answers that didn't match what I was seeing. That conflict lived inside me constantly. Loyalty pulling one way, instinct pulling harder the other. I wanted the man I believed in to be real. I wanted the story of our family to stay intact. But trust, once it cracks, doesn't shatter loudly, it thins, it weakens. I realized then that routine can hide a lot, familiarity can dull fear, and love can make us ignore the very signs meant to protect us. By that point, passive trust was no longer an option. I needed answers, and I knew they wouldn't come from asking politely anymore. The house was empty that morning, and the quiet felt different without anyone else inside it. Not peaceful, alert. I moved slowly, telling myself I was just looking, just easing my mind. I started in the kitchen, opening drawers where nothing ever changed, utensils, receipts, rubber bands. Each empty space tightened the knot in my chest. I checked the bathroom cabinet next, then the pantry. Still nothing. For a moment, I almost laughed at myself, embarrassed by how far my fear had taken me. But my feet carried me down the hallway anyway. In our bedroom, I stood still, listening to the soft hum of the house, and then opened his nightstand. The top layer looked ordinary enough. Coins, old papers, things that meant nothing. I almost closed it. Almost. Something made me reach farther back, past what was meant to be seen. That's when my fingers brushed against a small plastic bottle tucked behind everything else. The moment I held it, my body reacted, my hands went cold. My stomach dropped. It was plain. No label, no instructions, just a strip of tape with a single word written in familiar handwriting. Vitamins. Nothing about it felt harmless. I turned it over, shook it gently, and listened to the muted rattle inside. The pills were small and chalky, unmarked, anonymous. I stood there longer than I realized, staring at that bottle as the weight of it settled into me. This wasn't forgetfulness. This wasn't carelessness. This was something hidden on purpose. And hiding medication from a child's mother crossed a line I couldn't step back from. Fear surged, sharp and immediate. But it didn't paralyze me. It clarified me. In that moment, I understood that doubt was over. Whatever was happening, it was real, and it was dangerous. I slipped the bottle into my pocket, my hands steady now. Finding it wasn't the end. It was the beginning. I needed answers that didn't come from this house, and I knew exactly where I had to go next. Once the bottle was in my pocket, the house no longer felt like shelter. It felt like a place that had already failed us. I stood there for a moment, breathing slowly, letting the reality settle in. Whatever explanation I might have accepted before no longer mattered. This wasn't about trust or marriage or keeping the peace. It was about my child, and something inside me had already chosen. I argued with myself quietly. I told myself to wait, to gather more information, to avoid making a mistake that couldn't be undone. I thought about how easily action could turn into accusation, how quickly questions could become conflict. But every time I hesitated, I saw my daughter's heavy eyes and sluggish movements. I felt the weight of responsibility press harder than fear ever could. So I moved carefully and deliberately. I packed a small bag, not like we were leaving forever. but like we were stepping into something unknown. I helped my daughter into her shoes, smoothing her hair, keeping my voice calm even as my thoughts raced. She trusted me completely, and that trust demanded courage I didn't know I had until that moment. Leaving without permission felt wrong in a way I couldn't fully explain. It went against every habit I had built as a partner, but protecting a child doesn't wait for consensus. It doesn't ask for comfort. It acts. As I guided her out the door and into the car, the world felt strangely quiet, like it was holding its breath with me. I didn't know what we would find, only that not knowing anymore was the greater danger. I started the engine and drove toward the one place where answers didn't bend to reassurance or routine, toward people trained to see what others might miss. Whatever waited there, I was ready to face it. Hospitals have a way of making everything feel smaller. The voices soften, footsteps slow, and time stretches in uncomfortable ways. I sat beside my daughter in a narrow room that smelled faintly of antiseptic, watching her swing her feet gently as if nothing unusual was happening. She had slept nearly the entire drive there, her head resting against the window, and even now her eyes looked heavy, distant. I kept telling myself to breathe, to stay calm, to wait. Waiting was the hardest part. Minutes passed, then more. I stared at the clock without really seeing it, my thoughts circling the same question again and again. What if I was wrong? What if I had overreacted and dragged us into something unnecessary, and then, just as quickly, another thought cut through that doubt. What if I hadn't come at all? When the doctor finally returned, I didn't hear every word clearly. I didn't need to. I understood enough. The pills weren't harmless. They weren't vitamins. They were a sedative, meant to make an adult drowsy, found in my child's system at levels no child should ever have. As the explanation settled in, something inside me broke open. Grief hit first, sharp and immediate. Then anger followed, cold and focused. I looked at my daughter, at her small hands resting in her lap, and felt the weight of what had already been taken from her, her energy, her clarity, her safety. The betrayal wasn't abstract anymore. It was measured, documented, undeniable. I thanked the doctor with a voice that didn't sound like mine and gathered our things. There was no discussion, no debate left to have. The truth had been spoken in a place that didn't soften facts to preserve feelings. As we walked out of that building, the world felt different, harder, clearer. I knew then that going home wasn't an option. Protecting my child meant distance, immediately and without compromise. Whatever came next, I would handle it. But first, I had to put space between her and the danger she never should have faced. I didn't go home after the hospital, not even to gather myself. The truth was too heavy to carry back into that space. I drove instead to the one place that had always felt steady, where my daughter could rest without questions or explanations. Every mile between us and that house felt necessary, like I was building a wall brick by brick. My mother opened the door before I could knock properly. I remember how my daughter leaned into her without hesitation, how her body relaxed in a way it hadn't for weeks. Watching that nearly undid me. I asked for time, for quiet, for her to stay there just a little while longer. I didn't explain everything. I couldn't yet. Some truths need distance before they can be spoken. Leaving my child behind, even in safety, was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I kissed her hair, breathed her in, and promised I would be back soon. That promise had weight now. It wasn't just comfort, it was a vow. As I walked back to my car alone, the fear rushed in, loud and sharp. But I didn't let it turn me around. I knew confronting him immediately would only create chaos. Answers shouted in anger wouldn't protect anyone. What my daughter needed first was space. Calm, time for her body and mind to clear. Protection doesn't always look like fighting. Sometimes it looks like stepping away and holding steady. When I returned to the empty house, the silence felt different again. This time, it felt intentional, with her safe. I could wait. I could watch. I could prepare. The truth was still coming, but now it would come on my terms. The house felt hollow without my daughter in it. Every sound echoed longer than it should have, and every room held the shape of what was missing. I made the choice to stay, not because it was comfortable, but because it was necessary. This wasn't the moment for confrontation. This was the moment for patience. I prepared quietly. I moved through the house with intention, placing things back exactly where they belonged, making sure nothing looked disturbed. I needed the day to unfold as normally as possible. Truth doesn't always respond to pressure, but it often reveals itself when it believes it's unseen. Holding back my fear took effort. Every instinct in me wanted to act, to demand explanations, to force answers into the open. Instead, I stayed still. Time slowed. Minutes stretched into long, uneasy pauses. I noticed details I would have ignored before: the low hum of the refrigerator, the way afternoon light shifted across the floor, the sound of my own breathing when the house was completely silent. Waiting became an act of discipline. I reminded myself that reacting emotionally would only give me fragments. What I needed was clarity. As the hours passed, my thoughts sharpened. I wasn't guessing anymore. I was observing. I was letting patterns form instead of chasing conclusions. There was a strange calm in that focus, a sense that by doing nothing, I was finally doing something right. I understood then that truth has weight. It takes time to arrive. You can rush toward it and miss what matters, or you can make space and let it walk straight toward you. I chose to wait. By the time the front door finally opened later that day, my heart was already pounding, not from panic, but from certainty. Something was about to step into the light. And whatever it was, I knew I would be ready to see it. I sat alone in my car with my phone in my hand, the screen glowing brighter than it should have in the quiet afternoon. I told myself to breathe before pressing play. Even though I already felt sick, part of me still hoped I would see nothing, that this waiting would end in relief. That hope lasted only seconds. At first, my mind struggled to understand what my eyes were seeing. The familiar shape of my living room came into focus. The couch, the lamp, the angle I knew by heart. Then movement, then recognition. My body reacted before my thoughts could catch up. My heart slammed hard against my ribs, and my mouth went dry. I watched my husband walk into that space and act like it belonged to someone else. I watched another woman follow him in with ease, with comfort, like she had done it before. The way they moved around each other wasn't clumsy or hesitant. It was practiced, intimate. I felt something tear loose inside me as I realized this wasn't a mistake or a single bad decision. It was a pattern. I had to look away at one point, pressing my hand over my mouth to keep from making a sound. Then I forced myself to keep watching. Every laugh, every casual touch, every moment of ease rewrote the past weeks in my mind. The pills, my daughter's sleep, the hours he claimed were spent elsewhere. Suddenly, it all lined up with horrifying clarity. This wasn't just betrayal of me. It was betrayal of our child. I understood then why silence had been necessary, why she had been made small and quiet, why her needs had been inconvenient. Seeing it stripped away the last excuses I hadn't even realized I was still holding. The pain was sharp, but it didn't scatter me. It focused me. Watching that footage felt like crossing a line I could never step back over. Love, denial, and confusion fell away, leaving only truth. When the video ended, I didn't cry right away. I sat there, phone heavy in my hand, and let the reality settle. Emotional devastation had done its damage. What remained was resolve. This was no longer just about what I felt. It was about what had been done, what had been taken, and what would now have consequences. I wiped my face, saved the footage carefully, and knew my next steps would be measured, not emotional. There was more to uncover, and I was done looking away. That night, after the house had gone quiet again, I opened the laptop we once shared without thinking. I told myself I was just looking for reassurance, something to prove I was wrong about the rest. What I found did the opposite. Line by line, the numbers began to tell a story I hadn't wanted to imagine. At first, it looked like ordinary spending, dinners, weekend charges, small indulgences I might have overlooked before. Then I kept scrolling. The dates stretched back months, overlapping with moments I remembered clearly. Nights he said he was working late or traveling for meetings, hotels, restaurants I'd never been to, gifts that had never crossed our threshold. The pattern formed slowly. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. What hit me hardest wasn't the total, it was the source. This wasn't extra money, it was ours. Savings meant for emergencies, money we had talked about using for our child's future. Every charge felt like another quiet theft, not just of trust, but of stability. I felt anger rise, sharp and steady, as I realized how carefully this had been hidden. The affair wasn't impulsive, it was planned, budgeted, sustained over time. Seeing it laid out in transactions stripped away any lingering doubt about intention. This wasn't chaos, it was choice after choice, made with full awareness of who would pay the price. I printed what I found and set the pages neatly into a folder. The act felt grounding, almost calming. Pain loses some of its power when it becomes evidence. By the time I closed the laptop, my hands were steady. This wasn't just something to survive anymore. It was something to confront properly, with facts, with preparation, with consequences that matched the damage done. Once the evidence was laid out in front of me, something inside me settled. The chaos of emotion gave way to a quieter, sharper focus. I stopped reacting and started preparing. I gathered everything carefully, stacking documents, backing up files, labeling what mattered. Each small action felt like reclaiming a piece of ground I had lost without realizing it. I reached out for legal guidance. Choosing someone who spoke plainly and listened closely, I didn't need promises. I needed clarity. I learned what steps mattered and which ones could wait. I learned the value of patience. Every choice I made from that point forward was intentional, measured against one question: would this protect my child and our future? Staying silent took more strength than speaking ever had. I moved through the house as usual, answered questions without revealing anything, and kept my emotions tucked carefully away. It felt unnatural at first, carrying so much knowledge without letting it spill. But restraint became its own kind of armor. I wasn't hiding out of fear anymore. I was waiting because I was ready. In the quiet moments, I noticed how different I felt, less frantic, more grounded. Pain was still there, but it no longer drove me. I was thinking ahead now, imagining outcomes instead of reliving wounds. For the first time in weeks, I felt in control of my own story again. By the time everything was organized, I knew this wasn't about revenge or confrontation for its own sake. It was about accountability, about drawing a line that couldn't be crossed again. Preparation was nearly complete, and the truth would soon be shared in a room where denial had no place to hide. The room was quiet in a way that felt deliberate, almost ceremonial. I had chosen it carefully, a neutral space where no one could retreat into familiarity or comfort. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with everything that had been left unsaid. I remember sitting down and feeling how still my body was, how steady my breathing had become. I was no longer afraid of what might happen next. I had insisted on a witness being there, someone whose presence alone demanded honesty, not to escalate, not to threaten, but to anchor the moment in reality. This was not a private argument that could be rewritten later. This was truth stepping into the open. At first, there was silence, long, stretching seconds where no one moved. I let it exist. I had learned that silence can be more revealing than confrontation. Then, one by one, I laid everything out, the records, the images, the timeline that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. Each piece spoke for itself. As the weight of it settled, I felt a strange calm deepen inside me. Denial didn't explode or argue its way out. It simply collapsed under its own emptiness. I watched the illusion unravel without feeling the urge to rescue it. That part of me was gone. What surprised me most was my own clarity. I wasn't shaking. I wasn't pleading to be understood. I was present, fully aware that this moment marked an ending, not just of a marriage, but of a version of myself who had tried to hold everything together at her own expense. When it was over, nothing needed to be said. The truth had been witnessed. It could not be folded back into secrecy or softened by excuses. I stood up knowing that whatever followed would no longer be negotiated in private shadows. This was the moment the story crossed out of my hands and into record, consequence, and law. And as I walked away, I felt the clean certainty of a door closing behind me, one that would never open again. The courtroom felt smaller than I expected, stripped of drama and emotion, just wood, paper, and quiet authority. I sat there steady, hands folded, listening to the low hum of procedure. By then, I had learned that justice doesn't rush. It moves carefully, deliberately, as if aware of the weight it carries. The evidence was presented again, not as accusation, but as record, documents, timelines, expert findings, all laid out in an order that left no room for interpretation. I watched as facts replaced feelings. What I had lived through privately was now being examined under rules that did not bend for excuses or charm. The presence of witnesses mattered here. So did consistency. So did truth. As everything was reviewed, I felt strangely detached, like I was standing beside myself, not numb, just clear. This was no longer about convincing anyone of my pain. The system didn't need my emotions to function. It needed proof, and there was plenty of it. When the ruling came, I didn't feel triumph. There was no surge of satisfaction or relief that knocked the air from my lungs. What I felt instead was gravity, a deep, grounding sense that something irreversible had been set in motion. The truth had crossed a threshold. It had become law. I understood then that justice isn't loud. It doesn't celebrate. It closes doors quietly and locks them for a reason. As I stood to leave, I felt the space it created around me, not emptiness, but room. Room to breathe, room to protect, room to begin again. Carrying forward not revenge, but closure and resolve. We moved into a smaller place on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just quiet. The rooms echoed at first, not with fear, but with possibility. I remember unpacking boxes slowly, letting each object find its place, as if order itself could teach us how to breathe again. The light came in differently there, softer, kinder. My child changed in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't looking closely, sleeping through the night, eating without hesitation, laughing in short bursts that no longer sounded forced. There were still hard days, moments when the past pressed in without warning, but they passed more quickly. I learned not to rush those moments away. Healing needed patience, not pressure. We built routines that anchored us, morning walks, simple dinners, evenings where we read side by side, not talking much, just being near each other. Trust came back in pieces, earned through repetition. Every ordinary day was a quiet promise kept. I didn't pretend everything was fixed. I knew better than that. Recovery didn't arrive all at once. It showed up in consistency, in the absence of dread, in the way my body slowly unclenched. The house felt safe. Not because nothing bad could ever happen again, but because I knew I would act. When I look back now, the contrast is stark. Fear once filled every corner. Now there is space. Life is different, permanently changed. But so am I. What was broken didn't disappear. It was rebuilt with care, and in that process, something stronger took its place. There was a moment in this story when everything felt fragile, when the distance between safety and loss was thinner than I ever imagined. I didn't recognize it at first. Most of us don't. Danger rarely announces itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers, and we have to decide whether we are brave enough to listen. What I learned is simple, but it changed my life. Instinct is not fear. It is information. Courage is not confrontation. It is protection and trust, when broken, is not a failure of love, but a call to clarity. I didn't become strong overnight. I became strong one decision at a time, by choosing truth even when it hurt, and safety even when it cost me everything familiar. If you are listening to this and something inside you feels unsettled, I want you to know this. You are not imagining it. You are not weak for questioning. You are allowed to protect yourself. You are allowed to protect your children, waiting, watching, and choosing carefully can still be acts of strength. Thank you for holding space for this story. Thank you for listening with empathy and patience. If any part of this journey resonated with you, or if you have faced a moment where instinct asked you to act, I invite you to share in the comments. What did you learn when you finally listened to yourself?